Hello and welcome back to Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. I'm Tim Willoughby, this is Simon Gertzen, and after what was a pretty epic one-game match that we got to see in the last round, we're moving to the feature match area for some slightly quicker potential matchups. Let's head back down to our feature match area for round 5 of Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. Hello and welcome to this round 5 of Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. I'm Tim Willoughby. I'm here with Simon Gertzen, and we're going to get a chance to see some more decks from our modern metagame and the players in our feature match area right now, ready and raring to go. We're starting things off. We got Makis Matsoukas from Team Snapcardster, and he is one of the Greek players who's had a great deal of success in the last few years. And on the other side of the table, Javier Dominguez made the finals of the World Championship, just this most recent World Championship, looking very happy to be in the feature match area again. And every reason to be happy, both of these players on 4-0. And we've got some pretty aggressive decks in our feature match area this round. Javier Dominguez, he is playing 5-color humans, one of the comparatively new modern decks in this field. It gets to leverage having almost perfect mana thanks to Unclaimed Territory, Ancient Ziggurat, and Cavern of Souls, and play all the best humans from across all 5 colors. Meanwhile, Makis Matsoukas, he is on Affinity, and between Memnite and Ornithopter, he can potentially get lots of permanents on the battlefield early, and we will find out soon enough what his big turn 2 play is, because as much as turn 1's important for Affinity, often the 2 cost is where we see the real power sitting for many Affinity lists.
Yeah, not the most explosive draw. We don't see Mox Opal or Springleaf Drum. And Javier's on the play, so he's going to be the first one to get aggressive here.
So, Champion of the Parish on turn 1 from Javier Dominguez, and then he plays Meddling Mage. Now, Meddling Mage has some very powerful interactions in this deck with the likes of Kitesail Freebooter. You can simply look at your opponent's hand and already have perfect information with which to figure out what to name. Here, Javier Dominguez is going to have to lean on the fact that he understands the modern format very well and use that to do a blind name of a card that he's most concerned about playing against from this Affinity deck on the other side of the table.
I think Cranial Plating could be a good card to name here, but there are other cards at 2 mana. Steel Overseer, which we see right now. Arcbound Ravager is another one.
Now, one of the interesting things about this humans deck, I say it's got nigh on perfect mana. Those Ancient Ziggurats, they only tap for mana for creatures. And this deck, replete with creatures, not so many spells whatsoever. And that means that it's got a bunch of constraints in one regard, but then assuming that you can work within those constraints, a huge amount of power, given that Javier really doesn't need to worry about the color of his spells, and we see him playing Reflector Mage, dealing with that Steel Overseer for essentially 2 turns, meaning that Makis Matsoukas has to play something different on turn 3, goes for an Etched Champion with Metalcraft, Welding Jar as well, meaning that Makis' creatures very, very safe against what Javier has going on, but on the same tenet, he's not attacking at all. This is an Affinity deck that 3 turns into the game has not troubled Javier Dominguez's life total whatsoever, and that's somewhat unusual.
Yes, and Edge Champion in the main deck already shows that Makis is not trying to play a more defensive game, but he's set up to play a more defensive game. Of course, Edge Champion becomes really scary only with Cranial Plating, which is currently uncastable thanks to Meddling Mage.
Next turn, of course, Steel Overseer will be liable to get cast again. That Champion of the Parish getting gradually larger with each progressive human being cast here. Noble Hierarch, and there is a follow-up here, and it looks to be a Mantis Rider. Just the one flyer in play currently for Makis Matsoukas, that and Ornithopter, which does not fight especially well against the Flying Vigilance Haste creature from Khans of Tarkir, played by Javier Dominguez here.
Javier has effectively 2 attacks here. Attacking for 4 with only the Mantis Rider is one option, gaining the benefit of Exalted, or attacking with everything but the Meddling Mage. In this case, there's no really good block for Makis, and he will take 1 more damage in the one more damage more in the process.
So that is the play that Javier made, though. You saw him pause a little bit, clearly thinking through both of those options, deciding how he wanted to play it out. I guess that, in principle, Makis could have started thinking about blocking with those Inkmoth Nexus, animating them. And if that happened, then it works out that infect tokens can shrink down some of those creatures. As things stand, though, Makis Matsoukas electing to go down to 8, plays his Steel Overseer once more, and let's see what his follow-up is. He does have a Galvanic Blast, meaning he's only taken the 1 hit from that Mantis Rider.
And that's pretty huge because the Mantis Rider was the most problematic card on the battlefield. Champion of the Parish actually not that big of a problem, considering that you have an edge champion with protection from all colors.
Now, Javier Dominguez has drawn one of the few creatures in his deck that does not have creature type human, that being a Phantasmal Image. Conveniently, his Ancient Ziggurats, they're not tied down to being one creature type needed to be able to cast them, so he will be able to cast this illusion perfectly fine. The question is, what of his various creatures does he want to copy? Elects to go with his mage to bounce that Steel Overseer once more. It's really not had a chance to have any impact on the game here, as every time it comes down, it is getting bounced at the first opportunity by that Reflector Mage.
That's very important for Javier because one activation of the Overseer can already be hugely problematic. You have 2 Inkmoth Nexus on the battlefield, you have a few smaller creatures on the battlefield and an edge champion, and suddenly the board is not only super good on defense, but you're also threatening to win with poison in 1 or 2 turns.
Yeah, the poison a really interesting line of attack for the Affinity deck, and one of the reasons that it's so difficult to sideboard against aggro in a general sense in Modern, because against some decks, life gain is fantastic. Against Affinity, life gain may do completely nothing if there happens to be a strong Inkmoth Nexus draw.
Yeah, and this is actually a block that Makis had available earlier, but didn't want to commit to until he knew more about how this game was shaping up. Look how he kept open 1 mana for Inkmoth Nexus to have a 3rd artifact if necessary. Not that that's very relevant against Humans deck. They don't play a lot of spell interaction, but still a good play to make.
So Makis Matsoukas clearly trying to make clear which of his copies of Blinkmoth Nexus have just been played that turn, so there's no confusion about what has haste, what does not, or is not able to attack. And a very interesting pickup for Javier Dominguez in this game 1. He just drew Kessig Malcontents, a card that, not one that we've seen a whole lot in any format up until this point, but in a deck where every single one of your creatures is a human and where almost all of the permanents in your deck that aren't lands are humans, Kessig Malcontents represents quite a lot of damage here. He's casting it and he's immediately threatening just 5 damage straight to Makis Matsoukas' head, 1 for each human that he has in play here.
Yeah, and this card is actually pretty amazing in the Humans deck, giving it some reach that was previously lacking. And when we say 5-color humans, it used to actually be 4-color humans, but Mantis Rider sometimes costs red, which is pretty irrelevant. So with Kessig Malcontents, it actually has an additional line of attack. And I have to say, this card looks very promising to me.
Yeah, and one can easily imagine a set of lines of play where you play a Kessig Malcontents, you then play a Phantasmal Image to copy it, and you've represented a lot of damage without having to get through in the red zone. Considering that this is a deck that is almost exclusively permanents, it's amazing how many spells it feels like Javier Dominguez has.
And his draw has not even included Athalia's Lieutenant.
Yeah, Thalia, a big piece of the puzzle potentially for this deck that is, aside from Ether Vial, all about just getting humans into play the old-fashioned way, tapping lands for whichever color needed to make that happen.
Lands or Ether Vials, if you want to be a bit more unfair. By the way, some players at this tournament did manage to put Collected Company into their Humans deck. So something that's very difficult if you're relying on Ancient Ziggurat, but it's definitely a thing. So if you're interested in more 5-color Humans tech, I'm sure we will see this in the feature match area as well at some point.
As things stand, Makis Matsoukas, he was never able to get off to that kind of electric start that we sometimes see from Affinity decks, where they just get 4, 5 permanents down by the second turn and take control of the game before anything has happened. In this instance, it was Javier Dominguez having a 1-drop, having a 2-drop, being able to get on the board early and disrupt just enough to make Matsoukas' life very difficult. And here comes Thalia's Lieutenant. Lots of counters all over this battlefield, and that will be enough to make blocking very problematic indeed for Makis Matsoukas here.
It doesn't actually change so much about which of these creatures were lethal. Champion of the Parish as a 9/9 is just as lethal as before. The Malcontents were lethal, and both the Hierarch and the Phantasmal Image copying Reflector Mage are still not lethal. So in some way, this drop was not completely backbreaking. In others, of course, it did not make things easier for Makis.
Yeah, this a tough spot for Makis Matsoukas here. Still more attacks being piled on, and you have to know that it's not a good sign for you once Meddling Mage is getting into the red zone. And the second turn in a row that Javier has been happy to commit the powerful 2/2 originally designed by Chris Pacula upon winning the Invitational many moons ago.
So the thing that Makis has to think about is there a way to survive this attack and still have an out towards, for example, Cranial Plating and winning with Inkmoth Nexus? But I don't think he has the mana to do that. The cheapest card to pump up Inkmoth Nexus is actually Arcbound Ravager, which synergizes really nicely with Steel Overseer. But, well, if you don't have that many permanents left, there is actually not much to do about it.
This is nothing, and you take 2 to 1.
Makis Matsoukas perilously close to having to reach for his sideboard here. I'm guessing that this is one of the decks that he will have had in mind when building that sideboard. In spite of it being new, it's very much a talked about deck in this format right now.
5-color Humans was one of the most expected decks at this event, and it didn't disappoint. It's in the top 3 of decks being played. All 3 are aggro decks, and we saw the metagame breakdown earlier. It's 5-color Humans with, what was it? I think 43 decks. So this is the number 1 deck at the tournament.
Master of Ethereum coming down. It is relatively large in and of itself, and of course pumping the rest of Makis Matsoukas' team. A couple of quick updates for you. Toshiki Akai has won his game 1 in an Affinity mirror match against Adriano Moscato, and a different kind of an artifact deck, Shaheen Sahari, winning his game 1 with Ironworks combo, where apparently he was able to cast Emrakul, the Eon's Torn, by presumably generating a gigantic amount of mana thanks to Crocline Ironworks, and then casting one of the scariest threats in the entirety of Modern. And that a difficult title to hold, because there are, of course, a lot of cards in Modern and various ways of doing all sorts of naughty business. It's amazing here how Javier Dominguez, the curve on his deck, it ends at 3. The most expensive spell that he has to cast costs just 3 mana, and that means that the fact that he's got a 10/10 Champion of the Parish in play, kind of all the more impressive. He's got a terrifying, borderline Eldrazi-sized creature that cost him just the 1 mana.
Absolutely, and that's pretty cool. The thing about Humans is it's easy to flood out. If you draw 5 or 6 lands, that's 2 less of these huge threats. And Makis' defense was just good enough to survive here, and now he might actually be threatening something. If you look at the 2 Inkmoth Nexus, they already are representing 3 poison by themselves. That's 5 with the Master. That's 7 with Steel Overseer. So Makis is only two points of poison short of killing Javier this turn.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly the Affinity deck can string something together here. Right now, Makis Matsoukas happy to sit on his heels. If he's not attacking decisively for the win, he would rather hang out and wait until he's able to do so. Horizon Canopy there, drawing Javier Dominguez a card. That one way of mitigating the potential for this deck to flood out. And for those versions running Collected Company, of course, it's a source of green mana consistently that many of the other lands in the deck do not.
So this is now incredibly close, because Javier knows if he passes the turn once again, that he's in big trouble against the Seal Overseer. And Makis is actually holding Master of Ethereum. He didn't cast it because he knows that he needs to animate his Inkmoth Nexus this turn.
So if you're Javier Dominguez here, strangely, the life totals are 20-1, and he does need to very carefully consider what happens if he doesn't attack here, which is not good for him in the slightest.
He didn't attack at all? He also doesn't have a flyer on defense? That seems strange to me.
From nowhere, Makis Matsoukas proving that it's not necessarily about who gets the damage in early here. He's very carefully adding things up, making sure that maybe he hasn't miscalculated somewhere. The Humans deck not known for its instant speed interaction unless it has an Ether Vial in play.
Yeah, and I'm very surprised. Even if Javier doesn't think he can win by attacking, he has to realize that he's just facing lethal if he passes the turn. So I don't understand this passive play.
I can only presume here that he didn't factor in either a Master of Ethereum or a Still Overseer here.
Or the cheeky 1 point of poison that Makis dealt very early on.
Yeah, this is the reason why even in a apparently dire situation, sometimes it makes sense to get that small hit in. And Makis Matsoukas stealing victory from the jaws of defeat there, it must be said. Just passively looking on as he reaches to his sideboard. We will see more from both of these players soon enough after they have had a chance to do that crucial part of Modern, being sideboarding. We'll come back with all of their match soon enough. But first, these messages.
Want to play in the next Pro Tour? Qualifiers are happening this weekend on Magic Online. For more information, visit mtgo.com.
Hello and welcome back to this round 5 here at Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. I'm Tim Willoughby, joined by Simon Gertzen, and while the players in our main match are just figuring out the details of their sideboarding, we'll get back to them soon enough, we're going to get a chance to look in on Wukong Fai against Shaheen Sarani. Shaheen having picked up the Game 1 win with his Krark Clan Ironworks combo deck up against Burn. Now, on the face of things, this is a straightforward race. Burn is trying to deal as much damage as possible, and Shaheen is pressured into going off with his combo. His combo is pretty bonkers, Simon.
Yeah, and it's quite complex as well. So this is a deck that's almost purely based on artifacts, but very different from Lantern Control or Affinity. It's trying to get Krark Clan Ironworks into play, and then it goes off with Scrap Trawler and a bunch of cheap artifacts. So what you do is you sacrifice an artifact for 2 mana, and with Scrap Trawler, you can take a cheaper artifact back from your graveyard. And this means all these 2 mana artifacts get back a 1 mana artifact, which gets back a 0 mana artifact, and you don't go infinite, but you draw so many cards and make so much mana that you can just find your win condition, which is often Emrakul the Ant-Storm.
Yeah, also the potential to generate actual infinite mana with Mirror Retriever. You can sometimes put together something there where it's getting back more and more creatures. But Eidolon of the Great Revel in play, potentially quite a big problem for Shaheen Sarari, because he's got lots of cheap artifacts, and if he wants to fully go off, he is going to need to play a lot of them over the course of the game. So while the troublesome 2-drop is in play, he may well have to carefully navigate his way around this game. This is post-sideboard, so he may have some more removal having brought it in from the sideboard. But even in the main deck, he's got Engineered Explosives that potentially, if he can generate enough coloured mana, might be able to deal with the problematic 2-drop. So rest in peace coming down from Wukong Fai. Sorry, this another tricky card for Shaheen to play around. He's going to have a bit of a fiddly situation dealing with this. I think given how quick the first Dominguez and Matsoukas game was, maybe we should jump back to that one, see if we can get a little bit more affinity on Humans action, and then if this one's still going on, we will be sure to bring you more of that one. Be interesting to see how that one plays. But for now, we're going to head back to World Championship finalist Javier Dominguez, a game down against Makis Matsoukas, where essentially Dominguez was winning for every single moment of the game until that brief moment that he was losing. But it turns out if that brief moment's the end of the game, that's good enough. Dominguez this time has his other 1-drop in Ether Vial, and Ether Vial potentially allows him to interact at instant speed in a way he simply couldn't in Game 1. His deck largely sorcery speed otherwise, and this game is where we see Makis Matsoukas powering out a few threats here. Ornithopter, Springleaf Drum, Mox Opal means a turn 1 Steel Overseer for Matsoukas, and these are the kind of starts that give Affinity its fearsome reputation in Modern.
Absolutely. Now, what do you do if you're the 5-color Humans player? You really need something interactive, just like in Game 1, where Reflector Mage actually bought a lot of time against Steel Overseer. Here, it would be best to have one of the sideboard cards, for example, Kataki War's Wage. That's, in essence, one of the best cards against Affinity.
Yeah, Kataki War's Wage, meaning that each and every one of the artifacts that Makis Matsoukas has in play essentially has an upkeep cost of 1. And while the Affinity deck can generate a fair amount of mana, that's still a big stretch on its resources, essentially meaning that new spells are difficult to cast, and a second copy of Steel Overseer comes down. There is a Cranial Plating in hand for Makis Matsoukas, but obviously it wants to have plenty of artifacts in play before it's doing too much. And right now, Matsoukas is in the build-up stage. He's making sure that he's got plenty of artifacts in play so that when the Cranial Plating does come down, it is a decisive, potentially game-ending threat.
And look at this battlefield on turn 2.
Ornithopter swinging in for 1, sending a message. The swing for 1 poison early in the game was enough for Makis Matsoukas to set up for an end game in Game 1. This time round, Ether Vials working for Javier Dominguez, and as time passes, that will mean that he can deploy each and every threat in his hand, but at some point, it may be that he simply runs out of threats here, and it's just going to be a matter of whether or not what he has is enough to deal with what is a fairly potent start from Makis Matsoukas in this game too.
I absolutely agree, but I don't know if dealing that point of damage was really worth it. Makis is holding a Galvanic Blast, and if he leaves that Ornithopter untapped, he actually has Galvanic Blast to take out Kataki. With the start he had, Kataki is one of the very few ways that Javier Dominguez can get back into the game, and it would be really, really difficult to beat it, even if you just have to pay the upkeep cost once. So I'm not entirely sure if attacking with Ornithopter there is actually something that maximizes your chances of winning.
So Reflector Mage does come down. We saw it doing so much good work for Javier Dominguez in Game 1, and once more it means that Steel Overseer apparently always the target for Reflector Mage in this matchup, at least based on what we've seen in this feature match area. Will not be able to be cast next turn. Of course, we know that Makis Matsoukas does have at least one great 2-cost threat to be able to play here. Phantasmal Image bouncing the other Steel Overseer. That has really cleared a path for this champion of the parish. Gets to get stuck in here. Both those Steel Overseers stranded in Matsoukas' hand for at least the next turn.
Yeah, and even here, dealing with a 4/4 champion of the parish for just a single red mana, I think would have been very valuable, given the tempo swing that Javier just created.
Blinkmoth Nexus, the pickup there. The various Nexus lands working very, very well in conjunction because they can be used to pump one another. Of course, also a source of flying creatures, meaning that cranial plating that much scarier, that much more easy to get through with damage, because when it comes right down to it, Javier Dominguez does not have that many flyers in his deck. Galvanic Blast, maybe it was a little late, but ultimately it does do the job, taking out Champion of the Parish here. A relatively aggressive line from Matsoukas, considering what you've been talking about, Simon, about maintaining Kataki insurance.
I think we can see now very clearly the cost that Makis paid, the price that Makis paid for attacking with Ornithopter last turn. Given that he Galvanic Blasted Champion of the Parish this turn, he would have loved to do that one turn earlier before taking damage. Also, he knows that Javier doesn't have Kataki in his hand. Of course, if he top decks it, that's another story.
Another top deck that would have been pretty spectacular, a Meddling Mage there, stranding those 2 copies of Steel Overseer in Makis Matsoukas' hand, would have been very potent. As things stand, Mantis Rider getting a hit in, also pretty decent.
One of the reasons why 5-color Humans is so popular and so powerful is because Reflector Mage, Meddling Mage, Kitesail Freebooter all work very well together. You can know a lot about the opponent's hand and really disrupt them accordingly.
Signal Pest coming alongside Steel Overseer, and with those 2 copies of Springleaf Drum, if Makis Matsoukas wants to tap down low, he can get that extra copy of Steel Overseer onto the battlefield if he so chooses. That will kind of leave shields down though, and with just 8 life, I'm not sure that he can afford to be doing that.
Well, you don't want to be chump blocking with Steel Overseer, and having Steel Overseers in play is so valuable. You need them in play as soon as possible. So I absolutely like this decision.
Well, just to let you know, guys, in our feature match area, games falling thick and fast, but we have some exciting Game 3s on the cards. Ken Yukihiro and Peter Sahurek, they will be going to Game 3, as will Wukong Fai and Shaheen Sarari. It turns out that the start that we saw on camera against Shaheen, enough to disrupt his combo, just to the extent that it meant that the Burn player able to take down Game 2.
No surprise to me. Eidolon of the Great Revels is already hard to deal with, but following that up with a Rest in Peace is backbreaking.
And we also are going to have a Game 3 between Toshiki Okai and Adriana Moscato. That the Affinity mirror, potentially explosive starts abounding in that matchup. Every single one of our matches in the feature match area going to a Game 3, apart from this one, which, you know, there's still a bit of time to figure out whether or not that'll be the case. Signal Pest naturally not having any power, but difficult to block, and with cranial plating working for it, there's actually quite a lot of damage coming here through on Javier Dominguez.
And this is a very nice line here. It's aggressive, but it's correct to try to finish the game quickly for Makis. And he has 2 3/3s on defense. Well, virtual 3/3s in the 2 Steel Overseers. So the 2 Reflector Mages on Javier's side can't really attack. Javier flooding out, one of these issues that we mentioned. 5-color Humans, too many mana sources and either Vala mana sources as well. are just not what this deck can afford to draw.
Yeah, we saw kind of the pump fake from Javier Dominguez tapping his Ether Vial on 3 in response to attacks last turn from Makis Matsoukas. There was nothing to put into play there, and maybe a little bit of showmanship from Dominguez.
Well, you can make a game theoretical argument that it's actually more correct to tap Ether Vial even when you can't use it than not. But overall, it's going to make a very minor difference to how games play out.
So the Phantasmal Image masquerading as a Reflector Mage comes in, and 2 Steel Overseers blocking. Matsoukas animates his Blinkmoth Nexus before starting to use Steel Overseer, just so he can get those extra counters on the land while it's a creature. And there's still more counters being thrown around. Once you get multiple Steel Overseers all working together, it doesn't take too long for creatures to turn into veritable armies.
Yeah, Steel Overseer is the most fragile of the big threats in the Affinity deck, but it's also the most scary if you manage to untap with it.
Yeah, Matsoukas here on 4 untaps with a pretty scary force. We'll see what he's able to add to it thanks to this draw step.
So the artifact count is currently 6, but there is a Blinkmoth Nexus that could be 7. Signal Pass already has 2 power, so Makis has lethal just on the board. He only needs to figure out if it might be better to add something else to the battlefield, to not rely on this being a lethal attack. On the other hand, Javier is not even threatening lethal at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing that Javier has going for him in this game is the fact that with Ether Vials in play, he can at least make some pretense at the fact that he can interact even on Makis Matsoukas' turn. Now, a second Cranial Plating and a swing here, enough that he is taking a gigantic amount of damage and ultimately has to extend the hand there. Affinity taking it down in 2. In each game, Makis Matsoukas looking like he was in a little bit of trouble, but in every case, he was able to find a way out of it. In game 1, it was poison. In game 2, it was straightforward beatdown. But either way round, he was able to put it together. And we're going to get a chance to jump back to see the game 3 between Wukong Fai and Shaheen Sarani. We didn't really get to see too much of the Burn versus Ironworks combo game in game 2. And ultimately, by the sounds of it, there wasn't much of a game to be played. Here, as we're jumping back, I believe that there is already an Eidolon the Great Revel once again in play for the Burn player, and this, again, could be a big problem for Shaheen. So there we see our board thus far. We're still in the relatively early stages of the game. There's a Grim Lavamancer alongside that Eidolon in play on the Burn side of things, plus a whole hand of Burn spells. The life totals, as yet, not too troubled. Meanwhile, on Shaheen's side of things, he had a Scrap Trawler, was able to use it to some effect before it got taken off the battlefield. I guess creatures difficult to keep around in the face of all of this burn. We'll see whether or not Shaheen is able to piece something together. Once his deck starts going off, it does a lot of damage, but he's going to be taking a lot of damage as a second copy of Eidolon of the Great Revel comes in play. His deck is full of cards that cost 3 or less. Indeed, this whole format is. Eidolon of the Great Revel, a big spoiler for a lot of what people are trying to do in this format.
Yeah, you can see how punishing it is here. Shaheen actually has Collective Brutality to fight Eidolon, but multiple of them are really tough to deal with. By the way, to understand Shaheen's deck, you have to know what Scrap Trawler does. This is the card that actually enabled Ironworks to come back as a combo deck. So another benefit of the card is actually it also triggers of itself. So being removed by Grim Lavamancer or also by a control deck also allows you to get additional value. And then once Ironworks hits, you start this insane cycling machine.
As things stand, Shaheen Sarani, unable to get things to hit, draws off the top of his deck, finds Kraken and Ironworks. This is definitely a deck that needs to find its key pieces. Obviously, the likes of Chromatic Star helping to draw through the deck and get there, but even though he's able to pick up game one, casting a key Emrakul to close that one out, it was the sideboard plan and the key Eidolons of Wukong Fai that was able to take down the match 2-1. And I think that this is going to be a story we're going to hear time and again over the course of this weekend, how important games 2 and 3 end up being in Modern once people had a chance to adapt.
Yeah, and I'm not so hopeful for Shaheen's future here, because do you really want to play in a metagame where the top 3 decks are Affinity, Burn, and 5-color Humans? That seems like you're going to get beaten down a lot with this combo deck.
So we're getting a chance to see Adriano Moscato against Toshiki Okai, and both of these players on Affinity, but we see some interesting spice here on the right-hand side of our table. That is Hazaret the Fervent in play for the Affinity deck. Not a card that I've seen in Affinity before, but an interesting one that is utterly unafraid of all of the artifact removal, which is typically the classic answer to what Affinity has going on.
It looks like Toshiki is heavily red with his version, playing only a single Master of Ethereum in the main deck, but 4 Galvanic Blasts. And he has a Hazaret the Fervent in his sideboard, so that's where that's from.
Now, 2 copies of Cranial Plating for the 1 Ornithopter. It's wearing a couple of hats. Both of those hats are about beatdown, though. Single-minded in spite of the 2 different pieces of headwear, or 2 similar pieces of headwear, I suppose. And we've got a strange kind of a race going on here. If it works out that Moscato is able to find a Cranial Plating of his own, of course, Vault Scourge that he has in play does have lifelink, and that could be enough to swing things.
So the Affinity Mirror actually comes down to different levels of racing, and of course one of the things is if you both have Cranial Platings and one person has the Ancient Grudge, the other one doesn't, that's easy. The one with more Cranial Plating just wins. But once both players have huge threats, in this case Okai doesn't have a Cranial Plating, but Hazaret counts as well, then it comes down to racing the opponent in the most effective way, and often that means not allowing certain chump blocks to happen, and especially flyers are key in that regard. So you will often see players chump block with something like a Blinkmoth Nexus, or block with something like the Blinkmoth Nexus, because it's actually more tricky to keep it as a blocker than Ornithopter, because it doesn't require mana to block.
And I really do think that Affinity, one of the decks that that challenges the idea that playing aggro decks is the easy way out compared to playing control. It's an incredibly intricate deck to play, both in terms of sequencing to get the most damage. But here we can see Wear Tear coming down, a key sideboard card, and Moscato doing everything that he can to try and put this game away before things get closed out by Toshiki Okai with his fantastic Hazaret the Fervent in this matchup.
Okai is now struggling here because what he wanted to do was to block Ornithopter and then pump the blocking Blinkmoth Nexus to a 2/2. Now that Wear is taking out the Blinkmoth Nexus, I don't think he has enough mana to do that. Or does he? Or maybe if he floated the mana, he might still be able to do it. No, actually a chump block.
Yeah, we're in a weird spot where both sides have plenty of access to flying, so when in some matchups that would be a massive trump. Here, flyers bounce off each other just as easily as everything else.
And that importance of flyers is the reason why we see a powerful card in the matchup, like Wear Tear, being used on a Blinkmoth Nexus, which we usually wouldn't call spectacular.
And Toshiki Okai needs to be careful here. I believe he's got 2 cards in hand right now, which means that exactly as we stand, that Hazaret will not be able to attack.
Yeah, but also both players have to be careful because of life totals, of course.
There comes...
If you do like this is in combat.
This is not a problem, but you need to take a decision, please. You need to play.
Yeah, I asked the...
No, but the tap and tap is not a problem.
Not in combat.
Yeah. Japanese?
Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can.
Cheeky Okai there, playing out his Mem Knight. He's got just the one card in hand, so Hazoret gets to attack here. Land's getting thrown under the bus, left, right, and center here as each player desperately tries to maintain their remaining points of life.
OK has already been told to speed up his play. This is game 3. Both players are at really low life totals. I believe we might see a replay of the previous turn where Okai will try to block with Blinkmoth next, and you can see it there on the screen. It is able to give itself +1/+1 after having blocked.
Yeah, that just enough, of course, to give the power needed to trade with Ornithopter.
But Moscato has a Blinkmoth Nexus there, and his artifact count, if his artifact count is 6 or higher, he can equip the second flyer on his battlefield and attack with both of them. But then Okai has the Vault Scourge to block with, so it's a very, very close situation here.
All right, Adriano Moscato kicked things off with just the Ornithopter attacking. Blinkmoth Nexus offers up a trade here, which Adriano Moscato accepts. And his follow-up play is a Vault Scourge of his own. Now, Vault Scourge, a very, very scary creature when you've got that many cranial platings, because the lifelink on it, not that exciting when it's just a 1/1, but when it's a 6/1, 7/1, 8/1, even if it's getting blocked, is really turning this race around.
Oh yeah, this is super close. Moscato is now playing just like Okai, planning to chump block with Blinkmoth Nexus. Of course, wants to keep his Vault Scourge around at all costs.
Okai plays an Ornithopter in order to make sure that he's able to attack with this Hazoret. It will, of course, be yet another creature that's able to block even a flying Vault Scourge here. We've never quite hit a point where the activated ability of Hazoret seems important, but in principle, at some point in the future, it could become relevant.
One card. One card. Yes.
Yeah, both players taking their time. It's a difficult matchup, actually. One of the most difficult aggro mirrors to wrap your head around. And this Hazoret certainly doesn't make it easier.
Yeah, we can see Darksteel Citadel, the only card left in Okai's hand at this point. And Moscato drops to 1 on this attack. A dangerous position to be in. Not quite enough mana available to Okai on the face of things here that he's going to be able to finish things off with Hazoret. And unfortunately, if he plays the land, he doesn't have any cards in hand to discard to its ability. Each of these players very carefully thinking out their plays here. It's 1-1. They're both undefeated thus far, 4-0, a perfect record thus far in the tournament. And if they can navigate it through potentially one more turn for either player, ought to be enough to secure victory here. Okai, you see he has the slight advantage. 1 life versus 7 is a happy place to be. But with those cranial platings plus Vault Scourge, that could turn around fairly quickly.
With an artifact count of 5, we can expect at least 11 life gain for Moscato this turn. But the problem is not really the life total anymore. The problem is Hazoret. Even if you can take another hit of it, suddenly you are left without a real option to win the game because there's too many flying blockers on Okai's side. But I think the game plan is relatively clear. You have to equip Vault Scourge, try to gain the maximum amount of life. Okai will trade with his Vault Scourge, and then you will rely on that Blinkmoth Nexus as the final threat to take down the game.
This is an interesting line that Adriano's gone with here. He's only equipped the 1 cranial plating for now. He does have appropriate mana that he can equip at instant speed with the Glimmer Void and Mox Opal for black, and attacking with 2 creatures here means that he can more consistently threaten to get damage through or indeed kill off 2 creatures blocking by Toshiki.
Yeah, and of course, you will not trick another Affinity player with this instant speed equip. It's something that's actually very common in the mid to late game to be able to instant speed equip cranial plating. So what we could see here is that Moscato values it higher to get rid of a chump blocker in the air than to gain more life. Well, he could have gained more life this turn, but then he would have probably needed 2 turns to threaten a victory.
So the shield's down now for Adriano Moscato, but he certainly believes that at 9 life that leaves him relatively safe. The pickup there, Girpa Ether Grid, a really interesting card that can make smaller creatures have to look out for themselves, because once it's in play, it will mean that Toshiki Yokai can tap 2 artifacts, deal 1 damage to target creature or player, and both the creature and the player element, if games go long, can be very relevant indeed.
But Okai is short. He's short on artifacts. If he taps mana for Girapur Ether Grid, he's actually tapped out.
So Adriano Moscato there gets as many artifacts in play as he can, equips up his Blinkmoth Nexus, and that enough to mean that he's able to win the game. And you can see a big sigh of relief for him there. That was not an easy round for him whatsoever, but he got there.
Yeah, and he
found a way.
He was rewarded for attacking with both creatures and giving his opponent the least amount of time that way.
We have seen a lot of different plays with artifacts in this round, both in the main deck and in the sideboard. It was a really tricky, interesting one for Makis Matsoukas in his match against Humans. Then we had the Affinity Mirror, and then, of course, Shaheen Sarani. We didn't get to see the full works of everything that his deck can do, pun very much intended. But you know what? We will find out all about it as we get a deck tech with him soon enough after these messages.
Welcome back to Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan. Rich Hagan here at the desk. Quick turnaround before round number 6 because there aren't that many matches still going. Out on the floor, Brian David Marshall has managed to corral one of the best players of the last 5 years or so. You can almost know him by the initials now. It's LS, but it's not V, it's LST.
Thanks, Rich. I'm here with Li Shitian, one of the premier modern players on the Pro Tour. You have 3 Pro Tour top 8s in this format. What is it about this format that allows you to do so well?
Because the format is about doing some broken things, and I like doing broken things. Like I try not to interact with people when I play modern. So I try to explore different strategy, and then I find it fun.
Now, so many people, when we watch them play Modern, play the same deck all the time. They're the Affinity guy, or the Burn Girl, or the, but you have 3 very different decks that you've played in your 3 top 8s. You're playing a 4th different deck today.
Yes. I play Skate Shift, I play Blue Moon, I played Burn before, and I'm playing a blue-white control now because of just it's a metagame core to the format.
Now, I assume you hold up with MTG mint card, bent card. You guys all just kind of jammed in a house, and they took advantage of your knowledge, and everybody's playing this same blue-white control deck on the team.
That's not true because like we have players that already committed to some deck, so they master the deck, and then some of us can we adapt our play strategy. We want to adapt the metagame, then we pick the metagame core deck. But some of them just stick to what they have, and then they just adjust a bit the sideboard. Then here we go.
So 6 players on MTG mint card. How many different decks?
6. We got people who really like the deck they've been playing for a really long time. So yeah, just play what you like.
All right.
Yeah, because Modern is a format that you need a knowledge to your deck, so that you know what to do after sideboard or even in every game decision.
Now, you said you made a metagame call in your blue-white control deck. As you look around the room, do you feel like you made the right call?
At this moment, I think the pop-up deck is the Tron and the Horror one, which is something I did not expect so much, but I do expect Human or some Burn or Human, Burn, Affinity, Shadow, and so far I think it's a good matchup for Blue-White. So I'm happy with it.
All right, well, Li Shitian, I know the draft didn't go so well for you, 1 and 2, but thankfully we're deep into the modern rounds, 2-0, and looking to make a run here at Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan.
All right, thanks so much to Li Shitian. It's time now for another deck tag. It's time to find out how the iron actually does work in the company of a true gentleman and indeed literally a scholar.